State Senator Julian Cyr represents Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket in the Massachusetts State Senate. First elected to office in 2016, Cyr is among the youngest senators in the 40-member body. He serves as the Senate Assistant Majority Whip, as chair of the Joint Committee on Housing, and as vice chair of the Joint Committee on Public Health. A native of Cape Cod, Cyr spent 14 summers washing dishes and waiting tables at Adrian's Restaurant, a popular eatery in Truro where his parents were the proprietors for many years. Cyr says that experience was character building, taught him a lot about life, and helped shape his commitment to serving constituents today. In this wide-ranging interview with PFLAG Cape Cod's Rick Kuntz, Cyr talks not only about his political career and aspirations, but also about his legislative priorities for the Cape and Islands, among them affordable housing, health care, and dealing with the reality of climate change. He also shares his personal backstory about coming of age as a young gay man in the 1980s and 90s, and about how being gay and a native of Cape Cod forever shaped his approach to life, politics, and public service. Senator Julian Cyr, welcome to Profiles in LGBTQ Courage. It's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
For those of you who are listening from out of our region and who may not know you, you are the state senator representing Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket in the Massachusetts State Senate. You were elected to office in 2016 and been very active on Cape, and I want to talk with you about your legislative priorities and initiatives. But before we get to any of that, I know you're a Cape Cod native. You've got some stories to share, so please tell us about your growing up and coming out story.
Sure. First of all, Rick, thank you so much for having me and for, we're getting to record this at the Cultural Center of Cape Cod, which is a wonderful community center in South Yarmouth. So really good to be here. So for the uninitiated, I'm a lifelong Cape Codder. I was born and raised in Truro. My parents had a seasonal restaurant in Truro for 28 years, and I spent sort of more years of my life, working in that restaurant. Julys and Augusts were spent waiting on tables and bussing tables and working behind the line. And I'm someone who got my start in public policy and I got my start really around advocacy and arts advocacy when I was a junior in high school. I was a member of a honors chorus. We had a chorus I went to Nauset. I'm a Truro kid, went to Nauset, which is the regional school district here on the Lower Cape and the Outer Cape. Kind of got my first taste of organizing and activism. We had a pretty significant budget cuts to the school budget in my junior year of high school that if the member towns of the district voters at town meeting didn't pass what's called a Proposition 2.5 override, the school would be having to eliminate a number of teaching positions, including my choir teacher, including a lot of the music program. So that was sort of the first time I sort of was like, well, we can't let this happen. I had never done anything political before. My parents are restaurateurs. They're washashores. They're not sort of political. They're good Democrats, but they're not political people. Kind of was like, we can't let this happen, and got involved. We led a student-led campaign, and we were successful. It was sort of the first time I was like, hey, I can step out into my community and instigate change. And, in many respects, I've been kind of riffing on that ever since.
Yeah. What did you learn about yourself when you discovered that you had a flair for interest in politics? What was the biggest insight you had about yourself?
About myself. So I actually find that running for office or sort of thinking about running for office is not sort of dissimilar to coming out, right? There's something about, I think, our politics, especially in the modern era and the era when I kind of came of age where, politics is less and less of seen as less and less of sort of noble service, but is seen as sort of a unsavory, sort of dirty thing. And so, I think it took many, many years from, when I was a 16 or 17-year-old at Nauset High School who just really, cared about the program that I was in. Look, I was a closeted queer kid, a fat closeted queer kid who had sort of, buried himself in academics and joining this chorus and, I think having a real community, having friends, right, as someone who had a childhood where like I didn't have a very social childhood. I'm I'm making up for it now, but
You do get around.
yeah.
All over the Cape.
I know we're recording this just after Bear Week, so I'm a little exhausted. But really, I think then I was like, hey, look, this is really important to me, right? I can't let this sort of happen. And putting those values sort of into action. It was many, many more years. I think when I was 16, 17 years old, I was like, hey, I'm gonna do this work, right? I want to be an advocate for the arts. Later, I want to be an advocate and work on health policy. Then it was like, look, I want to go work for and be part of the team for people like Deval Patrick, who is our governor here in Massachusetts, or, work on the Obama campaign. And I think then further down the road was like, hey, wait a minute, maybe this is something I would be good at doing. But that really wasn't until sort of 2013, 2014, when I sort of was like, hey, wait a minute, maybe I want to run for office someday, but not something I sort of certainly in high school, I would have been horrified to learn that, at 30 years old, I'd be like back home living on Cape Cod, running for public office. I probably would have been mortified at the thought of it. So,
well, speaking of coming out, when did you come out? At what age? And can you share a story or a circumstance that was definitive for you?
Sure. So I grew up in the Outer Cape. I grew up in Truro. My parents are Washershores. My dad came to Provincetown in 1974. After Labor Day, he got a job dishwashing at the Red Inn. He worked there for 11 years. My mom worked there for a number of years as well. They opened their own business in 1984, started a life, had kids. They moved to Truro for their dogs. They originally lived in Provincetown. But so much of my parents' sort of chosen family, extended family, and my biological family included LGBTQ people. I had my dad's family, so from a big French-Canadian family, have a lesbian aunt, Auntie Hootie, who lived on Cape Cod and was very present in my life as a kid. And about, probably maybe half of my parents' friends as I was growing up as a kid were gay men and lesbians and queer folk. And so certainly I can't remember a time. I always was aware of and knew of LGBTQ people, right? I also sort of had a bit of the experience of, when you're a quiet, effeminate, shy, precocious, perhaps, blonde little kid growing up in Truro, I knew that adults perceived me as gay, as queer, long before I had, any sort of attraction to other men or even had a concept of my own queerness. So in some respects, I definitely knew that I definitely felt that I was different. And I knew that adults, especially LGBTQ adults, could sort of see that. I was one of these kids who, you would say, who read, right? And I think there was a tremendous amount of privilege that someone like me had getting to grow up on the Outer Cape, just seeing scores of LGBTQ plus people, living fulfilling, robust lives who are leaders in our community. My sixth grade teacher, John Van Cott, was openly gay and was a, remarkable person I'm still in touch with, is still a friend. And, his partner, Ben, was very active in the school and taught acting classes. And so, very, very much in some respects, when you look at, factors of resiliency for LGBTQ people, I think I had a lot of those sort of factors in my life. That being said, it particularly, in a certain period in the 1990s and the late 90s, where we had more and more, I think, visibility of LGBTQ people, we also, I think, had a real, there was more and more of that sort of backlash and bullying. I went from, very small, tight-knit elementary school in Truro to, a big, bad regional middle school.
Nauset, right?
Nauset, right? No. I mean, it was a perfectly great, fine school, but, the environment.
That's a big change.
It was a big change, and it was very homophobic, right? And I was, immediately in going to middle school, I was like, okay, whoa, like I'm not going to do theater classes because, that's gay. I'm going to sort of create some distance from that. And so, really was, I think was still sort of had difficulties that I think many young queer folks experience. Yeah. And then I think actually a big part of it was, in high school, I had the good fortune to be in this honors chorus that I joined at the start of my junior year. And that was really transformational for me. I think it gave me a real community, this tight-knit group of people, a sense of myself, and kind of coming back to myself that I had in elementary school, right, where I was kind of a theater kid and doing a lot of music. And in Truro elementary school, kids would say, oh, like, you're gay, right? But as a almost as a statement of fact, like, you have blonde hair, you're gay, like your parents own a restaurant. In middle school, gay was a slur word, right? And so I think in some respects that experience of that chorus kind of helped me kind of come back to myself, helped me come out first to my friends and close friends, then to my sister, and then I actually became pretty out in school by the time I was a senior in high school. I, was a student representative on the school committee. I would talk about LGBTQ issues on the school committee. I still yet hadn't had the conversation with my parents. If you've met my parents, they're extraordinarily cool people. And so one night at dinner, I had enrolled early decision to go to NYU. In part because it's an extraordinary school, in part because at the time, and I think still
New York
today,
City.
It's the gayest school, it's the queerest school in the country. And just, I think I've been very blessed by having a really sort of supportive, wonderful, amazing community, but it still had its difficulties. And I think there was a part of it that was difficult too, it was like, oh, well, like, y'all have been sort of naming me as a queer person for like most of my life. Kind of coming to own that, I think, is it's sort of a unique, sort of specific experience. But then I really, I think then in college, I think I really embraced getting involved in queer activism, in LGBTQ peer education and health. And I think also kind of really was drawn to sort of a broader framework than just I think being gay, which I very much sort of understood what that was, growing up on the doorstep of Provincetown, but sort of broadening my lens around a queer focus on a broader LGBTQ community. I think that was helpful for me too, right? As a kid who, when you grow up on the doorstep of Provincetown, I was not one of these sort of like courageous kids who would like sneak into the A house at 16. Like that was not my jam. I have friends who are like that.
You went to Spiritus.
Oh, no. I was like too intimidated to do that. I do remember it, as when you're a high school kid or in college, the first time you go to Spiritus after the bars let out, it's quite an experience. I think at the end of the day, certainly this is something that's been a big sort of part of my life. And I also really recognize the tremendous privilege, that I have in this. I also sort of grew up in the backdrop of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, right? Where Provincetown was a community that lost so many people. My parents lost, scores of their closest friends that they had kind of come of age with. And, as a little kid going to memorial services at Herring Cove, or cheerleading at the Swim for Life on the beach in front of the boat slip, that really kind of was part of the backdrop of my childhood. And I think part of my, real interest, or I think part of my affinity to public service and certainly to public health is tied up in that.
Was part. Shaped by those experiences. And I was going to ask you, how has being gay and growing up in the Cape, how has it informed and shaped the nature of the approach you take to legislation and to really working in the political realm?
So, the Outer Cape is like a cool, weird, funky place, especially, in the era where I grew up, and not just from an LGBTQ perspective, right? Even now, John Waters has to paraphrase a John Waters quote, he says the weirdest people in Provincetown are the straight people now, right? And so in growing up in a community that, that people really kind of like live their life kind of to their own beat, right? To literally live at Land's End, whether you're gay or straight or otherwise, right? I think part of it's just kind of my orientation around how people should be able to live their lives. And, I think when you think of the
live and let live.
Live and let live. And when you think of some of the, I think, kind of strongest, most profound radical tenets of even the American political experiment, right? It's this concept of liberty, of being able to sort of determine the course of your own life and what that looks like. And it's really hard to grow up in a place like Truro and Provincetown and the Outer Cape without having sort of a deep-seated appreciation for that. I think also, I think I have a real understanding of my history, right? That I know that if I was born in a prior generation, someone like me wouldn't have the opportunities that I would have. Someone like me probably would be dead. And I think, I think certainly, especially for a lot of millennials who, maybe grew up, we're sort of the last generation to have grown up sort of before, HIV sort of moved into being a chronic sort of manageable condition in many respects. But I think me in particular, and growing up in the backdrop of the AIDS epidemic, I think certainly has not only informed my public service, but I think given me a real appreciation for how we kind of got here, that there's a real debt that's owed to the generation that's gone before us, and also that like really good, smart, queer informed public health like works.
Yeah.
When the COVID-19 pandemic happened, Cape Cod and the islands had some of the best vaccination rates, not just in the state, in the country. Places like Provincetown, actually, I remember July 2021, it's actually right after Bear Week, what we were grappling with was the emergence of the Delta outbreak. Provincetown discovered
I remember
Delta
that.
before almost
Yes.
any other community. And look, at first we were like,
Yes, I
kind of
remember it
ghoulishly
happened.
joking, right? Being like, oh God, like what hath we created here? It was a rainy July 4th weekend. What has happened? But the reality is that you've got a community of people who've had to learn how to have health-seeking behavior, right? Because it's life-saving.
The communities had to become resilient and resourceful.
And also understand that, like, if you're feeling sick, you go get tested. And so that's why with Delta, we figured out, Provincetown before almost any other, that, that basically you could have reinfection of COVID after vaccination. We saw that again with sort of MPOX. So a lot of these sort of public health lessons that I think, were forged in the generation, before mine, we've been really able to deploy, and I find incredibly helpful.
So I know that public health is very important to you, as is housing. And let's kind of pivot a little bit, talk about some of your legislative priorities. And I know, for example, you're vice chair of the bipartisan, I think, Public Health Commission within the state Senate. Talk a little bit about what I consider to be two of the biggest issues on the Cape, but I'd like to hear what they are. What are the big issues for you? I'm thinking housing, climate change, mental health, public health. Talk about those concerns and how they're shaping your activities now.
Sure. So, I mean, the biggest, most urgent issue we face on Cape Cod is housing, and I'll just kind of come back to that. I think around public health, what I really got involved in from a public policy perspective in college, and then thereafter when I went to go work in the Patrick administration, was to work at the Department of Public Health, and had the opportunity to work with brilliant openly LGBTQ leaders, right, like John Auerbach, Suzanne Condon, a whole sort of cohort of really just extraordinary public health folks, many of whom were queer. And so when I went to the legislature, that's sort of the real kind of experience that I had, right? Having worked on a whole myriad of issues. The Department of Public Health has 10 units and 100 programs. So in the work that I would do in the department, you would deal with hospital licensure, and you would deal with beaver trapping issues and environmental health exposures and a whole host of things, right? And so in the legislature, I've really that's been a natural area where I've focused. I've served on the Public Health Committee, every year since every session since I've served. I sit on all the other healthcare related committees. We have several in the legislature, and have really kind of sought to, just take kind of these good, public health just is so essential to the fabric of sort of our communities. And so a lot of public health work, a lot of mental health, also mental health. Was really honored to lead the Senate's initiative. Senate President Karen Spilka, her number one personal priority was transformation of mental health, which we did. And I was the lead author of the Mental Health ABC Act. It's the strongest mental health parity law in the country. So public health, mental health has been a really strong focus, elder affairs, health insurance coverage, all that kind of, both for my work and then also, for my district.
So I think it's fair to say that the public health infrastructure in the Commonwealth is more robust than it is in many states. First of all, do you agree with that? And secondly, what do you want to see the Commonwealth do in that domain that it's not doing yet?
So I think Massachusetts is one of a number of states who have really excellent public health programs, right, and leading public health programs. I think those, state public health is sort of, more important now than ever, given the real kind of strategic coordinated attack on public health that we're seeing from this current federal administration, where really, I don't want to turn this into a whole kind of podcast about, the litany of horrors that we're seeing in the Trump administration, but really this sort of dismantling of public trust in public health completely intentionally is going to have really catastrophic consequences. Yes, like day to day, right? But then also the next pandemic we have, we're just going to be really ill prepared. And so a lot of what our focus has been now is how do you take an organization like, a robust organization like our Department of Public Health, how do you, on some of these things where they've really relied on CDC or other sort of federal agencies, if they can't count on them anymore as a partner, then how are we, sharing disease surveillance, with other states? How are we able to make determinations and recommendations on vaccination when we can't trust the federal government? How do we ensure that access to gender-affirming care, remains unimpeded and uninterfered with? And so that's what a lot of our focus and a lot of our work has been doing.
Let's pivot to talk a little bit about housing. And my husband, John, read an article in the New York Times this past Sunday. You probably saw it.
The Nantucket article? I was interviewed for that, but I didn't make the cut.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So something to the effect, I have it right here, that 65% of the island's nearly 12,000 housing units are occupied by seasonal residents. So what do we do, in your view, Julian, about the housing crisis on the Cape?
So housing has been a crisis here since I was in middle school. The COVID-19 pandemic put that crisis on steroids, and we've seen the last 5 or 6 years, increase in valuations, 130, 160%, and we're really approaching a position certainly on Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, and on the Outer Cape where I live, but increasingly across the region, where if you don't yet own a home or going to inherit a home, and you are a year-round working person here, you will not be able to afford to purchase a home here. And it is increasingly difficult to compete for scarcity around rentals with such incentive for short-term rentals. So the task before Cape Codders and Islanders is really to figure out how do we, subsidize housing for most all year-round people. And the mechanisms that we have to deploy for affordable housing, largely through tax credits, but a few other state programs, these all are really focused on folks who make below area median income. And so we have to continue to support, those sort of traditional capital A affordable housing. Mm-hmm. But the conversation on Nantucket, the conversation on Martha's Vineyard, the conversation on Provincetown, the conversation hopefully soon here on the Mid-Cape needs to be, well, how do you basically subsidize and create a middle market for
public-private partnerships?
So a lot of that looks like, I think the model we're keen on comes from this Colorado ski towns, places like Vail, Colorado, where they've taken a tax, a fee, a transfer fee on real estate transactions and basically funneled the money into basically creating a middle market for housing, below market housing. What that looks like in Vail is these are deed restrictions, year-round deed restrictions that are purchased through that revenue that then basically say, if you look at the valuation of our properties here, it's all based on what it's worth in July and August, what it can rent for by the night or the week in those busiest summer months. If you remove the ability for a unit to be occupied seasonally, that it has to be occupied year round, its value decreases, and then we hope is more within reach of year-round working people. But the scale of what we're going to have to do here is simply enormous. And I've been really encouraged, actually, Nantucket, I think it deserves a tremendous amount of credit for really, I think, pushing the envelope in what they're able to do with existing resources. Provincetown, I think, is really caught up. Other towns here in the region have done a lot as well. Orleans, Wellfleet's moving forward into some exciting stuff. Barnstable built a lot of housing, but the scale of what we're going to need is quite steep.
That middle tier that you're talking about, is that going to require, I mentioned public-private partnerships, like a consortia of local businesses, churches, some local government? Is that what you envision? Or can you talk just a little bit more about the mechanism there?
So first, if you want to talk about business on Cape Cod, if you are a business of any substantial size, you are providing housing for your employees. This was something that, if you were in the hospitality business.
Very common in P-Town.
Very common, right? My parents had housing for some of our seasonal workers, at the time. But now, right, you have the hospital on Martha's Vineyard investing in 64 units of year-round housing for their employees. Most employers are actually, you're unable to open your doors if you don't have housing. So this is first and foremost, not only is this an issue of the fabric of our communities and who gets to live here, but it's also a real business issue, right? And a real question about, well, how do you throw this really big party that we do every summer in July and August when you really struggle to have a year-round community? We're seeing about 30% or more of our workforce commuting over those bridges each and every day. So the strategy here is that we need towns to have a mechanism for creating year-round housing. And we've basically given them the tools to do just that. Governor Healy signed into law the Affordable Homes Act last year. This was a $5.1 billion investment in housing. A provision that's included in the Affordable Homes Act is something called the Seasonal Communities Designation. Seasonal communities, if you're a seasonal community, so if you're a Dennis or a Provincetown or a Chilmark or a Nantucket, also some of the communities in the Berkshires, then you're able to do certain things. You can establish a year-round housing trust, basically a fiscal mechanism at the local level where you can subsidize housing above area median income. That's something Nantucket has done, as Provincetown's already done. That the town can purchase year-round deed restrictions on housing. The towns can actually provide housing for municipal workers without a carve-out in the law. They're unable to do that under federal fair housing. And then several other kind of policy initiatives that we're hoping begin to be the template for our towns addressing this issue. Of course, the challenge is the cost, right? Nantucket has probably $500 million housing problem. Martha's Vineyard, probably similar amount. On the Cape, we're even larger. The cost of having to basically create under market housing is truly going to be very enormous. This is why we want a transfer fee, right? If you look at the vast majority of real estate transactions here are investment properties, right? These are second or third or fourth homes. Transfer fees this is not sort of envelope pushing policy. Many, many places in the country, red and blue states have transfer fees. And they work sort of quite well. So this is, the revenue piece. Now we have sort of the toolkit and what we're going to need, but to really get those tools working at scale, we're going to need a very significant revenue source.
So it's no secret that we're living in very toxic political times. And are you hopeful about the state of our politics changing, evolving, getting better?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm very hopeful when I speak to other folks who are doing the work that I'm doing in my generation. Just, over the weekend, I was able to host a few friends they're in Boston for a program at the Kennedy School, actually. It's a leadership program, and there's several out elected officials, a state representative from Hawaii, a state representative from Michigan, a water commissioner from Chicago, right? These are LGBTQ people who are serving outly and proudly in their communities. I know you've had Zoe Zephyr on the show.
Yeah.
I think of a number of my friends, right, who are doing this work. Those folks, if they were in charge, I feel very optimistic sort of about their capacities and I think their vision. I'm increasingly, though, I'm pretty pessimistic that I think that those who are in charge now are going to, run into the ground before we even have a chance. And I think that's really I hate to kind of, deduce this to, kind of a simple generational, sort of piece. But, I feel like so much of the work, even that I'm doing today, are fixing a number of errors and mistakes and missed opportunities. Here on Cape Cod, for instance, right, we've had a wastewater problem for decades. And our predecessors chose not to sewer Cape Cod. When the federal government would have paid for 90% of the bill in the 70s, and they kicked the can. And, what have we been doing? What have I been spending so much time doing is, establishing a Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund that has a stable revenue source that then can realize, now the scores of projects we're seeing, right outside of the studio, the road's closed because they're finally sewering the road and they're sewering the street. I feel like that's so much of our work is sort of repairing missed opportunities. And so there's a lot of that. So I don't know. I feel very optimistic about the people I know who are doing this work. But, if you look at where we're going from a national level, if we keep on this track, I think we'll continue to just see this decline. And I think there's also a real question if you look at a state like Massachusetts, if you look at the Northeast, right, the New England states and the state of New York, we're the fifth largest economy in the world. Massachusetts has the number one education system, the number one healthcare system. We're the best for business in the country, right? We're doing so many things right. Look, we have big challenges, and some of these challenges are self-inflicted. Housing, right? Housing has nothing to do with MAGA or Trump or any national politics. This really has to do with, I think, mistakes that we've made here. We've really prioritized local control and wealth preservation at the expense of housing production. But all in all, a state like Massachusetts, we're doing so much right. And then you look at a state like Florida, where literally a third of their budget, a third of the budget they appropriate in their legislature is from the federal government. It's like, why are we doing this? Like, why are we enabling bad fiscal policy that you have, some states that are total freeloaders that are hijacking, now literally what we can do with our lives, right? And so I think that should be, and I hope needs to be, a really big part of the conversation, because if you look at why the United States has had unprecedented amount of wealth and unprecedented amount of opportunity. It's been because of places like Massachusetts. And I just think that really needs to be
wonderful, world-class universities, public healthcare system,
and look, I don't want to gloss over the work that we have to do or the sins that exist here, right? But I think this is sort of like the real tension. And, folks much sort of smarter than me with a higher pay grade, I think, have to figure this out. But you do sort of feel, especially at the federal level, that things are really challenging. I don't know. Look, I'm 39 years old. I'm a state senator. I don't know if I want to kind of be in the morass of what that is. I really like that I'm able to deliver for my constituents, on topics as sexy as wastewater funding or, housing or the mental health work we've done. We didn't talk a lot about, climate, right? All these things we're trying to do. And it just doesn't feel like the federal government is an environment that's really working anymore. And so I think this is what has to be sort of figured out.
Do you think the Democratic Party is going to figure it out? Because, we're seeing a fissure right now. On the one hand, there's the traditionalist and institutionalist wing of the Democratic Party. And then you have the young and up-and-coming populist progressive crowd, people like AOC and Richie Torres, the gay black congressman from the 15th Congressional District in New York. And then, of course, Zohran Mamdani. So it's a crowded room or a crowded tent. Where do you see yourself in that crowded space?
Well, I think that for the folks who are criticizing Mamdani or who are, I think they're missing the picture, right? If you look at what he did, right, he ran a very joyful, positive campaign, not just saying like, hey, vote for me because that guy's awful, but hey, vote for me because, we have an affordability crisis. We can do sort of better, right? And I think that positive message that's centered on really addressing the challenges and problems that are in people's lives. I think Democrats have failed, in many respects in connecting with this increasing widening gulf that we've had and where we just have had like unfettered wealth accumulation at the expense certainly of poor people, but increasingly of the middle class. I mean, I even look at so many of my friends, and I've been in this boat too, where, these are professional people who are overeducated and who have good careers and have no hope of being able to afford a home, which is a basic, the basic mechanism of wealth building in this country, since the post-war era. And so I get why folks are frustrated. I think it's a bit of a false choice, though, between Mamdani and AOC and focusing on one end and the more sort of a centrist approach. I think really the lesson should be about a positive campaign that's talking about affordability, giving people a vision for the future. I think Democrats need to have a Project 2029 and a Project 2027, really clearly spelling out what we're going to need to do. And I think we also need to be honest that there is a lot that has to be repaired. Yes, from this Trump era, and also much more broadly, right? You look at housing, that has very little to do with national politics, and actually the places where they have done better on housing has actually been in red states and red cities. It's blue states and blue cities actually that have had really atrocious housing policies. So, this isn't just about, but I think enough about just being a counterweight to Trump. I think also people need to learn to make space at the table. And I think, when you look at movement work, good movements do that. The LGBTQ movement, I think we've seen over years and years around making sort of space at that table. I think it's been really kind of crucial.
Yeah. To that point, I'm reminded of John Lewis talking about there comes a time to really engage in good trouble. And I'm curious, I know you know Lewis's work and his background. And what's your advice to members of the LGBTQ plus community who are concerned about their rights? What are ways to make good trouble, to shake the system in some ways?
I think first you got to figure out where you fit in your personality, your skills, your kind of orientation in making that good trouble, right? I'm someone who I think realized kind of pretty early on that like I was pretty good at navigating bureaucracies and institutions, and I'm someone who kind of is a bit of an institutionalist in some respects, right? And so that's where I think I think I can make kind of the most good trouble, right? But I think others are really, have real talents and skills about being in the streets or quite literally sort of acting up or civil disobedience. And I think you want to figure out where you sort of fit there. And then I think we need people to show up. We need people to act out and act up. I think we need to also realize, I think LGBTQ people, but especially like gay and lesbian people, need to realize that this attack on our trans siblings is not sort of an aberration, but I think is really just the first opening salvo on what will be kind of coming for us. And so I think that we have to be standing up unequivocally, for our trans siblings in this moment. But I think really, figuring out kind of where you fit.
Where your gifts and talents lie.
Yeah, right. And like what's going to be authentic to you, and also where you're living, right? I mean, I'm serving in Massachusetts, where I serve in a Senate with 40 members. We're a matriarchy. I have a lot of, things are kind of different maybe here in the Massachusetts Senate than say if you were, living in some sort of other state. So I think location matters as well, but I think figuring out where you fit.
Yeah. So just a couple more questions, one of which is, Zoe Zephyr. I did interview her for this series just after she came to national prominence for standing up and standing out in the Montana state legislature and really was a profile in LGBTQ plus courage. And I asked her in my interview with her, where did you get the guts, the gumption, and really the mojo to really confront injustice and bias headlong? And what she told me was that she had been a high school wrestler and she had learned some moves around how to present and position herself from having been a championship high school wrestler. I've never seen that in any article written or any interview that I've seen done with her. But I'm curious with you. So you grew up in Truro and you were kind of shy by your own admission. You're kind of a little retiring. And here you are now. You're really front and center. You're out there. Where did you find your mojo? What energizes you and gives you personal confidence, Julian?
So I think a lot of it goes back to working in a restaurant, right? When you're waiting on sort of scores of hungry, potentially disgruntled tourists, right? I always say like, look, if you can like wait on tables in August on Cape Cod, you can kind of do anything, right? And so, being able
crucible experience.
No, of course, right? And of course, at the time, right? At the time, of course, all I wanted to do was not have to work at my family's restaurant in Truro and I don't know, go work at the Muse or something fancy in Provincetown. Now, of course, my mother's getting the last laugh because here I am with a whole political career that is the restaurant's a big part of the story and the narrative. But I think the ability to see people where they are, meet people where they are, right? Sometimes you got a table who just wants to get in and out. Sometimes you have regular customers who want to hear all about the school, the semester and this and that. Being able to kind of, firmly and maybe with a little humor say no to someone. So that's sort of, I think, the skill set that enables me to do this work. I think a lot of my motivation is just a real appreciation that I've had a lot of really good fortune to grow up and live in a place a very special, sort of unique place that in many respects is eroding a heck of a lot faster than anything that's happening with rising seas, right? You look at the Outer Cape and Provincetown, and I think there's some elements of those communities in the Outer Cape that really represent the best of what's possible in the American experiment. And also that's eroding really quickly. A couple of summers ago, I knew 17 people who were leaving town in May because they couldn't afford housing. I couldn't live in these communities if my family didn't have a foothold here. My sister and sister-in-law who live in Brewster with my niece and nephew, had they not bought their house in 2018, there's no way in hell they'd be able to be here. And so I think I have this real understanding that if Cape Codders and Islanders of my generation don't step up and don't lead and don't be part of the solution, then this place isn't going to have a future. And I think, to your earlier question about optimism, I think that's true more broadly in this country, right? If millennials and people of goodwill sort of don't step up and sort of take our country back, then we're really not going to have a future, or we're going to have a future that is deeply unequal and probably a little fascist and not terribly fun or good and puts so much at risk, right? So I think a lot of it is just saying, look, if you care about this place, if you want to have some purpose in your life, having that grounded and work being grounded in that place and being involved in that place is just...
Get involved and give your talents and gifts for a greater purpose, it sounds like I hear you saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Julian, we've covered a lot of ground today. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that has kind of percolated up as we've talked here that you'd like to share as we wrap up?
I think for people who are drawn to this work, right, for getting involved, getting in good trouble, whether that means as an activist or even a politician, God forbid, I've really found, I think, that authenticity and being like sort of your authentic self is really kind of powerful stuff. And, for someone who I think didn't know if I could kind of bring my full self and my sort of authentic self, I've really found that when I've shown up as myself with my colleagues, there's been a tremendous amount of power there and a tremendous amount of respect. And I think that I've really sort of been amazed. This is my 9th year doing this job. I've been able to get twice as much done as I thought I could. And I realize a lot of that, I think, is luck and timing and being in the right place at the right time. A good chunk of that, I think, is relationships with people. But I think it's also, I think I've realized that the more I am myself, the more that I'm able to connect with people. And so much of this work, especially politics, especially legislative work, no one gets anything done on their own. If anything, the more kind of power you end up having, actually, the more you need other people, to really get things done. That's certainly true in a legislature. No one gets anything done on their own. And so I think just bringing your authentic self, I think especially as a queer person, we spend so much of our lives trying to mask who we are or hide who we are. And, at least in my experience, the more I've come back to myself, the more I've actually been able to get done and also have fun doing it. I think people sort of feel that they have to take themselves almost sort of too seriously in this work, especially if you're a young person in public service or a queer person, or a person of color or someone who looks a little different than everyone else in the room. And, I really have relied on, humor and fun and a little bit of goodwill there to connect with folks. So I don't know, just a few tidbits.
It sounds like you belong to yourself. You know who you are, and you own your power as part of the conversation and the political system that we're in today. So
at least in my day job, maybe not in my dating life, but
that's topic for another one.
Yeah, another one. We'll come back and do that.
Well, Senator Julian Cyr, I want to thank you again for being my guest today on Profiles in LGBTQ+ Courage. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
An absolute delight. And thank you for all the good work you do here on Cape Cod. And, we were together this winter for this fabulous event called the Gala Ball. Which is
come back next year. We'll have you come
in.
Honey,
I'll be there. I try to come almost every year. It's one of my favorite.
Let's make it a date.
My core constituency,
okay.
Right?
Let's make it a date.
Absolutely.
Thanks again. Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.